When a routine traffic stop spirals into a career-defining moment, a police officer's assumptions clash with an unexpected truth. His target turns out to be someone who holds his future in ways he could never have imagined. The sun was setting over the streets of Sacramento, painting the sky with streaks of gold. Maxwell Graham, a businessman in his late 40s, was driving home after a long day at the office. His sedan purred softly as he adjusted the air conditioning, eager to shake off the day's stress. The radio played quietly in the background, providing a calming soundtrack to the bustling city streets. As Maxwell approached a yellow light, he slowed down, only for it to turn red. Suddenly, blue and red lights flashed behind him, accompanied by the piercing wail of a siren. Glancing into his rearview mirror, Maxwell frowned slightly but pulled over to the side of the road. He rolled down his window as a police cruiser parked behind him and Officer Bradley Thompson stepped out. In his mid-30s, with a buzz cut and a badge gleaming on his chest, Thompson adjusted his belt and strode toward the car with the confidence of someone accustomed to being in control. "License and registration," Thompson said curtly, his voice flat but laced with authority. Maxwell complied silently, retrieving his registration from the glove compartment and handing over his license. His movements were calm and deliberate, though he could feel the officer's sharp gaze scanning him, searching for a reason to dig deeper. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Thompson asked, leaning closer to the window. "I'm not entirely sure," Maxwell replied politely, his tone even but firm. "You didn't come to a full stop at the light," Thompson said, though there was a faint hesitation in his voice. Maxwell frowned, but gave a small nod. "I see. I thought I slowed down in time, but I understand." Thompson didn't respond immediately. Instead, he lingered, his narrowed eyes studying Maxwell intently. What began as a routine stop was quickly turning into something more in the officer's mind. His posture shifted slightly, signaling that he saw this as more than a minor traffic violation. Glancing at the license in his hand, Thompson asked, "You're not from around here, are you?" Maxwell hesitated for a fraction of a second before replying, "I moved here a few months ago. My address is on the license." But Thompson wasn't really listening. His questions took on an edge, his tone betraying a growing suspicion. Maxwell's calm demeanor only seemed to unsettle him further. Leaning in closer, the officer asked, "Where were you headed in such a hurry?" "Just going home," Maxwell replied evenly, his tone steady despite the palpable tension. Thompson didn't see Maxwell as just another driver anymore. He saw something more, something he couldn't quite place but found suspicious. Maxwell sensed the shift but remained composed. He didn't flinch as Thompson folded his documents slowly, tucking them into his chest pocket with exaggerated deliberation. Straightening up, the officer's expression turned faintly smug, as though he had already decided what kind of man Maxwell was. "Step out of the car for me," Thompson ordered. Maxwell's grip on the steering wheel tightened briefly, but his face remained calm. "Is there a specific reason for that, officer?" he asked, his tone measured. Thompson's lips twitched, though he quickly masked it. "I ask you to step out of the car. You don't want to make this harder than it has to be." The unspoken threat hung in the air. Exhaling slowly, Maxwell opened the door and stepped out. Thompson's eyes scanned him, sizing him up. Maxwell was taller than the officer, his broad shoulders accentuated by a tailored suit. His polished shoes suggested a meticulous and professional nature, but none of that seemed to matter. "Hands where I can see them," Thompson instructed, gesturing toward the front of the car. Maxwell complied, his movements controlled and deliberate. "Is there something specific you're looking for, officer?" Maxwell asked, his tone calm. Thompson smirked faintly. "Just routine. We've had some incidents around here. You can never be too careful." Maxwell turned his head slightly, locking eyes with the officer. "Incidents involving men in business suits driving sedans?" The air grew heavy with unspoken tension as the two men stood there, the divide between assumption and reality widening with each passing second. Or does this have more to do with something else? The question hit like a jab, and for a moment, Officer Thompson's composure faltered. He straightened, his hand drifting toward his belt, a reflex more than a necessity. Watch your tone, he said, his voice hardening. I'm simply asking a question, Maxwell replied. There was no defiance in his voice, just a quiet firmness that seemed to unnerve the officer. Thompson leaned in closer, his eyes narrowing. You seem awfully familiar with how this works. Got something to hide? Maxwell let the silence hang for a moment before responding. No, officer. I just believe in being clear about the reasons for an interaction like this. Transparency, you know. Thompson scoffed but didn't respond. Instead, he stepped back, pacing a small circle in front of the car. The dynamic between them was shifting, though Thompson couldn't quite put his finger on why. Maxwell wasn't reacting the way most people did. There was no fear, no stammering, no nervous fidgeting. Instead, he exuded control, poise, and an unsettling calm that put Thompson on edge. You seem pretty confident, Thompson muttered, almost to himself. Like you think you know what's going to happen next. Maxwell didn't take the bait. Tilting his head slightly, he replied, Confidence isn't the issue here, officer. Respect is. Thompson froze for half a second before turning to face him. The smugness was gone, replaced by something sharper, almost defensive. He opened his mouth to reply, but no words came out. Maxwell's composure was throwing him off balance, and he didn't like it. As the silence stretched, the tension between them felt electric. Thompson began to realize this wasn't going to play out the way he had expected. Yet, instead of backing down, he doubled down. The real test was about to begin. Thompson tapped his fingers against the holster on his belt, his frustration barely concealed. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone like Maxwell. His gaze flicked back to the sedan, as though searching for a justification he hadn't yet conjured. Turn around and place your hands on the hood, Thompson said, his voice clipped. I need to check for weapons. Maxwell raised an eyebrow. Weapons, he repeated, his tone incredulous but measured. Do I look like someone who's carrying a weapon? Thompson's jaw tightened, and for a moment, his composure cracked. I'm not going to ask you again. Maxwell hesitated, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. Then, without a word, he turned and placed his palms flat against the hood of his car. Thompson approached, the crunch of his boots on the asphalt breaking the uneasy silence. The officer patted Maxwell down in quick, rough movements, his hands lingering longer than necessary. It wasn't just a search, it was an attempt to assert dominance, to provoke a reaction. But Maxwell didn't flinch, didn't stiffen, didn't so much as shift under the invasive scrutiny. You're clean, Thompson muttered, stepping back. The admission sounded begrudging, as though he were irritated that he hadn't found anything to justify his suspicion. Maxwell turned to face him, his expression calm, though his eyes were sharp. Of course, I am, he said simply. Now, officer, if you're done— I'm not done, Thompson interrupted, his voice rising slightly. The words tumbled out too quickly, betraying his need to regain control. You seem to know a lot about what I can and can't do. Care to explain why? Maxwell folded his arms, his posture relaxed despite the tension crackling between them. I've had my fair share of interactions with law enforcement, he said. Let's just say I've learned a lot over the years. Thompson's eyes narrowed. That's so? You a lawyer or something? Maxwell smiled faintly. Or something. The ambiguity in his answer irritated Thompson further. The officer stepped closer, invading Maxwell's personal space. His voice dropped to a near growl. Listen, you think you're smarter than me? Think you can talk your way out of this? Maxwell met his gaze evenly, unflinching. I don't think anything, officer. I just believe in fairness. And so far, I'm not seeing much of it here. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Thompson took the bait. Fairness. Thompson spat. You think fairness is what this is about? People like you always. He stopped himself abruptly, the unfinished sentence lingering like smoke. Maxwell's expression didn't change, but something about his posture shifted, a subtle, unmistakable signal that he'd caught exactly what Thompson had left unsaid. People like me? Maxwell repeated, his voice soft but charged with meaning. Thompson bristled, stepping back as if realizing he had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. You know what I mean, he muttered, though his tone lacked conviction. "I think I do," Maxwell replied quietly. His calmness was no longer passive. It was razor-sharp, cutting through the pretense like a blade. "And I think we both know this interaction stopped being about a traffic violation a long time ago." Thompson opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. For the first time, he looked uncertain, as though he wasn't sure how to proceed. The balance of power was shifting, and for the first time, Thompson found himself on shaky ground. The silence broke as Maxwell's voice cut through, steady and unyielding. "Officer, I think it's time you know who I am." Thompson's brows knitted, irritation flaring again. "I don't care who you are," he shot back. As the words hung in the air, Maxwell reached into his pocket slowly and deliberately. "I'm reaching for my badge," he said calmly, keeping his eyes on Thompson. The officer's hand twitched near his holster, but Maxwell's steady tone held firm. "No need for theatrics. I just want you to see it." Thompson's eyes followed Maxwell's hand as he pulled out a leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal a gleaming badge. "Maxwell Graham," he introduced himself, his tone casual yet laced with authority, head of Internal Affairs, Sacramento Division. The color drained from Thompson's face. His eyes darted between the badge and Maxwell, searching for a sign that this was a joke. But there was no humor in Maxwell's expression, just quiet authority and a flicker of disappointment. "Internal Affairs?" Thompson echoed, his voice cracking. "Yes," Maxwell replied firmly, cutting him off. "I oversee officer conduct. My job is to ensure that the people wearing this badge uphold the integrity and values it's meant to represent." Thompson stepped back, his hand dropping from his belt as though the badge he wore suddenly weighed him down. Maxwell stepped forward, his gaze piercing. "Do you know what the most troubling part of this interaction has been, Officer Thompson?" Maxwell asked, his voice calm yet pointed. Thompson didn't respond, his expression one of a man realizing he'd walked into quicksand. "It's not the profiling," Maxwell continued, his tone sharp. "Though that's bad enough. It's not the baseless escalation either. It's the fact that you've done all of this without even realizing who you were talking to. You assumed I wouldn't know my rights, that I wouldn't understand the laws you're sworn to uphold." "And why?" Thompson opened his mouth, but no words came out. Maxwell didn't wait. "Because I didn't fit your idea of someone deserving respect," he finished, his voice carrying the weight of an indictment. "That's not just a problem for me, officer. That's a problem for everyone you encounter in that uniform." Thompson's shoulders sagged under the weight of Maxwell's words. His gaze flicked back to the badge as if hoping it might vanish. Maxwell stepped back, giving the officer space but keeping his tone firm. "Here's what's going to happen," he said. "You're going to step back, return my documents, and think very carefully about what you say next." Thompson hesitated, clearly debating whether to argue. But Maxwell's next words sealed the decision. "You're going to hear from me again," he added, his voice dropping. "Not as a driver you stopped on the side of the road, but as the man tasked with deciding whether you're fit to wear that badge." Thompson swallowed hard, his hands trembling slightly as he pulled Maxwell's license and registration from his chest pocket. He handed them over without a word. Maxwell accepted them calmly, tucked them into his wallet, and stepped back toward his car. Pausing at the driver's door, he turned and locked eyes with Thompson one last time. "Remember this, Officer Thompson," he said. "The badge doesn't make you better than anyone. It makes you accountable to everyone." With that, Maxwell slid into his car and started the engine. As he drove away, the streetlights cast a dim glow on the shaken officer standing alone in the fading light. For Maxwell, the drive home was quiet, but his thoughts churned. The encounter wasn't unique. He had dealt with officers like Thompson before. But this time, things would be different. This time, Maxwell had the authority to act. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the blinds of Maxwell's office at the Sacramento Police Department's Internal Affairs Division. On his desk lay an open file labeled Officer Bradley Thompson. The contents revealed a pattern: minor complaints of unprofessional conduct, excessive stops, and vague misunderstandings that had never been properly addressed. Leaning back in his chair, Maxwell steepled his fingers and reflected. Thompson wasn't an anomaly. He was a symptom of a deeper problem. And Maxwell wasn't interested in slapping a bandage on a bullet wound. A knock on his office door interrupted his thoughts. His assistant, Linda, stepped in holding a stack of reports. "Good morning, Mr. Graham," she said. "I've got the summary on last month's misconduct cases. Also, Chief Daniels wanted me to remind you about the department review." The following week, Maxwell nodded as he took the files from Linda. "Thanks, Linda. Can you also schedule a meeting with Chief Daniels for this afternoon? There's something I need to discuss with him." Linda hesitated, sensing the weight behind Maxwell's words. "Of course," she said before stepping out of the room. Maxwell turned back to Thompson's file. But his focus wasn't solely on the officer. This wasn't just about one man or one incident. It was about the culture that enabled behavior like Thompson's. And if there was one thing Maxwell knew, it was that culture started at the top. Later that afternoon, Maxwell sat across from Chief Daniels in a conference room. Daniels, a seasoned veteran with salt and pepper hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, leaned back in his chair, listening intently as Maxwell recounted the traffic stop. "I could have written it off as just another bad interaction," Maxwell began, his voice steady but resolute. "But that would have been a mistake. Thompson's behavior isn't an isolated incident. It's a reflection of how much work we still have to do." Daniels rubbed his temples and exhaled slowly. "This isn't the first time Thompson's name has come up," he admitted. "But we've always handled it internally, quietly." "And that's the problem," Maxwell replied. "Quiet doesn't fix anything. Quiet lets it keep happening. It's time to be loud." Daniels studied him, the weight of the conversation etched into his face. "What are you proposing?" "A department-wide review," Maxwell said without hesitation. "Not just of individual officers but of our training, protocols, and accountability systems. We can't keep sweeping this under the rug. If we don't hold ourselves to a higher standard, how can we expect the community to trust us?" Daniels leaned forward, clasping his hands on the table. "You're going to ruffle some feathers with this?" "Good," Maxwell replied firmly. "It's about time someone did." The following weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, interviews, and reports. Maxwell worked tirelessly, compiling data, speaking with officers, and holding public forums to hear directly from the community. The Thompson incident became a catalyst for change, forcing the department to confront its flaws head-on. Thompson, for his part, faced an internal hearing. Maxwell made no secret of his involvement, sitting across from Thompson during the proceedings and watching as the officer squirmed under the scrutiny. The hearing resulted in a suspension, but Maxwell knew the true victory wasn't in punishing Thompson, it was in preventing the next Thompson. Months later, Maxwell stood at the podium of a community event, addressing a room filled with officers, city officials, and local residents. He didn't speak of blame. He spoke of responsibility, the shared duty to create a system that worked for everyone. "Justice isn't just about catching the bad guys," Maxwell said, his voice resonating through the hall. "It's about making sure the people sworn to protect and serve do so with integrity, fairness, and respect for everyone they encounter. That's the badge I believe in. And that's the badge we're building here, together." The applause was thunderous, but Maxwell didn't linger on it. For him, this wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a better one. As Maxwell stepped down from the podium, he glanced at the faces in the crowd. Some were skeptical, others hopeful, but all were listening. He knew change wouldn't come overnight, but it would come. And for now, that was enough. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Let's start the conversations that matter, the ones that lead to change. Subscribe to our channel for more stories like this, stories that challenge us, inspire us, and remind us of what we're capable of when we stand for what's right.